Outcast alien girl's fate, shunned by all, chosen by a human's heart. Imagine a galaxy teeming with chaos, where shadows hide secrets and the unwanted are cast aside like forgotten relics. What if I told you that an alien girl, shunned by her own kind, holds a destiny so vast it could reshape an entire world? And what if her fate hinges not on the stars, but on the heart of a human, a scarred drifter who dared to see her when no one else would? Prepare yourselves, because this tale of rejection, rebellion, and unbreakable bonds will pull you into a vortex of wonder and leave you questioning, can one choice defy an entire universe? Welcome to Sci-Fi Nebula, your cosmic gateway to stories that ignite the imagination and explore the uncharted edges of existence. I'm your host, and together we'll dive into the wild unknown. Before we blast off, do me a favor, smash that like button, share this journey with your crew, and hit subscribe to join our growing nebula of dreamers. We're racing toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support is the fuel that powers these epic adventures. Every click, every comment, lights up our path to bring you more mind-bending tales, so let's make it happen. Stick with us to the end, because the twists ahead will unravel secrets that hit harder than a plasma bolt. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this outcast's fate ignites a fire that burns across the stars. Ready? Let's launch into the void, full speed ahead. Chapter 1, Encounter in the Chaos Crowd. Jaxon navigated the throng with the ease of a man who'd walked darker paths. His brown hair hung in a messy tangle over his brow, half hiding the scar that jagged down his chin, a memento from a betrayal he'd never speak of. The leather of his pilot's jacket creaked as he moved, the faded insignia of a long-dead squadron barely visible on its sleeve. He wasn't here for the plasma rifles or illicit tech that drew most mercenaries to Vion 3's markets. His boots carried him past the weapon stalls, their neon signs buzzing, toward a quieter corner where shadows clung like old friends. There, tucked between a rusted bulkhead and a pile of scrap, stood a stall so small it might have been invisible to anyone not looking. Behind it was Sylra Keth, an alien girl of the Zynari species, her presence a soft anomaly in the station's harshness. Her skin shimmered a pale orange, like embers caught in twilight, and 3 slender tendrils sprouted from her head, swaying faintly as if stirred by an unseen breeze. Her hair, a deep violet cascade, spilled over her shoulders, framing a face both delicate and worn. Her black eyes, deep and unreadable, watched the crowd with a stillness that belied the chaos around her. Jaxon stopped, leaning against a nearby crate, his green-gray eyes taking her in. Her stall was a patchwork of odds and ends, trinkets carved from bone, bits of twisted wire, and small orange crystals that pulsed faintly, as if alive. He picked up one of the crystals, rolling it between his fingers. It caught the nebula's light, glowing brighter against his calloused skin. "Who made this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, rough from years of shouting over engines and gunfire. Sylra tilted her head, her tendrils shifting slightly. "I did," she said, her tone soft but resonant, like wind whispering through a void. "It's something from a place I don't remember." Her eyes flicked to the crystal, then back to him, a flicker of curiosity breaking her guarded calm. "It's better than the junk out there," Jaxon said, nodding toward the weapon stalls. "More soul in it than a dozen plasma rifles." He offered a faint smile, the kind that rarely reached his eyes but carried a warmth he didn't often let slip. Her lips twitched, a ghost of a smile that didn't quite bloom. "You're not like the others who come here," she said, stepping closer to adjust a trinket on the shelf. Her tattered cloak, a dull gray patched with threadbare holes, brushed the counter. "They want things that kill. You keep picking things that don't." "Maybe I've had enough of killing," he replied, though the words felt heavier than he'd meant. He set the crystal down, fishing a handful of credits from his pocket, scraped together from a smuggling run he'd barely survived. "How much?" 10, she said, her gaze lingering on him as he handed over the payment. Their fingers brushed, her skin warm against his, and for a moment, he felt a jolt, a connection he couldn't name, like static jumping between wires. The moment shattered as a guttural laugh erupted behind her. Crag, her employer, lumbered into view, his bulbous body a mass of glistening flesh and wriggling arms. His voice grated like gravel underfoot. "Wasting time again, Sylra. Don't bother with this human. No one wants a scrawny outcast like you, your own kind didn't even keep you." His laughter rolled, thick and cruel, drawing a few curious glances from nearby traders. Jaxon's jaw tightened, his hand flexing near the blaster holstered at his hip. He'd heard worse in his time, taunts, threats, the screams of dying friends, but something about Crag's words lit a spark of anger he hadn't felt in years. Sylra's shoulders slumped, her tendrils drooping, but she didn't flinch. "He's not wrong," she said quietly, turning to rearrange a shelf. "I'm an orphan. Zynari don't keep what's broken." "That doesn't make it right," Jaxon said, stepping closer, his voice low but firm. "Where I come from, Earth, we don't toss people aside just because they've got no one. Everyone's worth something." She paused, her hand hovering over a twisted wire sculpture, and glanced at him over her shoulder. "Earth," she echoed, the word foreign on her tongue. "What's it like?" "Green," he said, leaning against the counter. "Blue skies, open fields, at least, that's what I remember. Haven't been back in a decade. The galaxy's too big to stay still." "Must be nice," she murmured, her voice tinged with a longing she didn't bother to hide. "To choose where you go." "It's not always a choice," he admitted, his gaze drifting to the nebula outside. "Sometimes you're just running, from things you can't outrun." Her black eyes met his, and for a heartbeat, the noise of Vian 3 faded, the haggling, the clatter, the hum of engines. It was just them, two souls adrift in a sea of chaos, seeing something in each other they hadn't expected. Jaxon felt it then, a pull, faint but undeniable, like a thread tugging at the edges of his guarded heart. Crag's bellow broke the spell. "Sylra! Stop mooning over the human and move these crates." His arms flailed, knocking a trinket to the floor with a clatter. She sighed, her tendrils curling inward, and stepped away to obey. "I should go," she said, glancing at Jaxon. "Will you come back?" He nodded, tucking the crystal into his jacket pocket. "Count on it," he said, and turned to leave, the weight of her gaze lingering on his back as he melted into the crowd. The marketplace swallowed him again, its din crashing over him like a wave, but Jaxon's mind stayed on Sylra. Her quiet strength, her shadowed eyes, they stirred something he'd buried after Proxima 9, where he'd watched his squad burn in a trap he couldn't stop. He'd sworn then to keep his distance, to let no one close enough to hurt, or be hurt. But as he boarded the Eclipse runner, the crystal warm against his chest, he felt that vow waver. Back at her stall, Sylra watched him disappear, her fingers tracing the spot where his hand had brushed hers. Crag's taunts echoed in her ears, "No one wants you," a refrain she'd heard since childhood, abandoned on Vian 3 with no memory of why. She'd built walls from that pain, thick and unyielding, but Jaxon's words had slipped through a crack, "Everyone's worth something." She clutched a second crystal, its glow dimming in her hand, and wondered if he meant it, or if he'd vanish like everyone else. Outside, the Vortex Flame Nebula burned on, its light a silent witness to the fragile thread now tying them together, a thread that would soon pull them into a fate neither could foresee. Chapter 2, Light in the Dark Corner. Jaxon Varr guided the Eclipse runner through the cluttered docking bays of Vian 3, the ship's engines grumbling as they settled into a berth scarred by years of rough landings. It had been a week since he'd last seen Sylra Keth, a week spent hauling contraband through asteroid fields for a client who paid just enough to keep the fuel tanks full. The job had been a blur of tight maneuvers and near misses, but his mind kept drifting back to that cramped stall, to the alien girl with orange skin and violet hair, whose quiet voice lingered like an echo he couldn't shake. He stepped onto the station's platform, the air thick with the tang of burnt metal and the buzz of 100 alien dialects. His leather jacket hung loose over his frame, the crystal Sylra had sold him tucked safely in its pocket, a small weight that felt heavier than it should. The marketplace was as chaotic as ever, a tangle of limbs and voices beneath the flickering orange glow of the Vortex Flame Nebula outside. Jaxon wove through the crowd, his boots thudding against the grated floor, until he reached the familiar corner where Sylra's stall stood. She was there, arranging a row of wire trinkets with careful precision, her tendrils swaying gently as she worked. Her orange skin caught the nebula's light, giving her an ethereal shimmer that stood out against the station's grime. She didn't notice him at first, her black eyes focused on her task, but when she looked up and saw him, a faint smile curved her lips, small, hesitant, but real. "You came back," she said, her voice soft but warm, cutting through the din like a thread of calm. "Told you I would," Jaxon replied, leaning against the counter with a casual ease that belied the tension he'd carried all week. He pulled the crystal from his pocket, holding it up. "Kept this safe. Figured it deserved a better owner than some pirate." Her tendrils twitched, a sign of surprise he was starting to recognize. "Most don't keep things like that," she said, stepping closer. "They trade them off or lose them. Why'd you hold on to it?" He shrugged, rolling the crystal between his fingers. "Reminds me there's more out there than blasters and blood. Something worth keeping." Her smile grew, just a fraction, and she turned to adjust a shelf, giving him a moment to study her. The tattered gray cloak she wore was the same, its edges frayed, but there was a subtle shift in her, a lightness in her movements, like she'd been waiting for him. Crag was nowhere in sight, probably haggling somewhere deeper in the market, and Jaxon was glad for it. The bulbous creep's absence left the air cleaner. "Got a break coming up?" he asked, nodding toward the bustling crowd. "Thought we could talk somewhere less loud." Sylra glanced over her shoulder, her tendrils curling inward as if weighing the idea. "Crag's off with suppliers for a bit," she said. "There's a place, an old observation deck, up on level 5. It's quiet this time of day. Lead the way," he said, and she slipped out from behind the counter, hanging a small sign that read, "Back soon," in jagged alien script. Jaxon followed her through the station's winding corridors, marveling at how she navigated the chaos with a grace he'd never manage. Her cloak brushed against his arm as they moved, a fleeting contact that sent a ripple through him he didn't dwell on. The observation deck was a relic, its walls lined with dust-caked panels and a single wide window smudged with years of neglect. Beyond the glass, the Vortex Flame Nebula sprawled in full view, its fiery swirls of orange and purple pulsing like a living thing. The room was empty, the silence a stark contrast to the market below, broken only by the faint hum of the station's core. Sylra stepped to the window, her orange skin reflecting the nebula's glow, and stared out at the stars. "I come here sometimes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When Crag gives me longer breaks. It's the only place that feels bigger than this station." Jaxon joined her, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I get that," he said, his gaze following hers to the endless expanse. "Out there, it's easy to forget how small you are, or how trapped." She turned her head, her black eyes searching his face. "You feel trapped too?" "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice rougher than he intended. "Been running the galaxy since I left Earth. Thought it'd feel like freedom, but it's just empty, a lot of the time." "Earth," she said, tasting the word again. "You miss it?" He hesitated, his fingers brushing the scar on his chin. "Parts of it. The green, the quiet. But I don't fit there anymore. Too much happened, too many ghosts." She nodded, as if she understood more than he'd said, and looked back at the stars. "I don't even have ghosts," she murmured. "Just fragments, someone singing, a hand holding mine. Then nothing. Zynari don't keep orphans, not ones like me. I've been here as long as I can remember, selling junk to survive." "You're not junk," Jaxon said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He turned to face her fully, his green-gray eyes steady. "I've seen plenty of wrecks, ships, people. The ones that last are the ones with something inside them. You've got that." Her tendrils stilled, and she stared at him, her breath catching. "You don't know me," she said, but there was no bite in it, just a quiet ache. I know enough, he replied, stepping closer. I've seen you hold your own against Crag, against this place. That's not nothing. She didn't respond at first, just looked out at the nebula, her fingers curling against the window's edge. Then, slowly, she reached out, pointing to a faint star flickering in the distance. That one, she said. I always wonder what's there. If it's better than this. Her hand brushed his as she pointed, and Jaxon didn't pull away. Instead, he closed his fingers around hers, her warmth seeping into his skin. Maybe it is, he said, his voice low. Maybe we could find out. She froze, her black eyes locking with his, and for a moment, the galaxy shrank to just them, the hum of Vian 3, the nebulous glow, all fading into the background. He felt her pulse quicken under his grip, a silent rhythm that matched the thud in his own chest. She didn't pull back, letting her hand linger in his, and he wondered if she felt it too, this pull, this thread tying them together. The moment broke as his comm unit chirped, a sharp intrusion of static. Jaxon sighed, releasing her hand to tap the device on his wrist. Varr here, he said, his tone clipped. Captain, came the Eclipse Runner's AI, its voice cool and mechanical. Incoming encrypted message. High priority. Keywords, Zynari, Vian 3, target acquisition. Payment substantial. Jackson's jaw tightened, his mind racing. Hold it, he said, glancing at Sylra. She'd stepped back, her tendrils curling inward, watching him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Trouble? She asked. Maybe, he said, keeping his voice even. Nothing I can't handle. You. She shook her head, but her eyes lingered on him, searching. Crag'll be back soon, she said. I should go. Yeah, he agreed, though he didn't move right away. I'll find you tomorrow. Got a feeling we're not done talking. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Good, she said, and turned to leave, her cloak trailing behind her like a shadow. Jaxon watched her go, the warmth of her hand still ghosting on his skin, a quiet ache settling in his chest. Back on the Eclipse Runner, he decrypted the message alone, the AI's voice reciting words that chilled him, Zynari female, Vian 3, high value, eliminate or extract. No client name, just a bounty that could buy a fleet. He stared at the crystal on his console, its glow dimming, and thought of Sylra, her quiet strength, her shadowed eyes. Whatever she was running from, or toward, he'd just stepped into it. And for reasons he couldn't yet name, he wasn't walking away. Chapter 3, Both Beneath the Nebula's Flame. The Eclipse Runner hummed quietly in its berth, the faint glow of Vian 3's docking light seeping through the cockpit window as Jaxon Varr sat hunched over a workbench. His hands moved with practiced precision, shaping a thin strip of alloy salvaged from the ship's hull into a delicate circle. The metal shimmered faintly, its surface etched with the word Eclipse in jagged, uneven strokes, a mark of his world, his refuge. He'd spent the night wrestling with the encrypted message about a Zynari target, the bounty's weight gnawing at him, but his thoughts kept circling back to Sylra Keth. Her voice, her touch, the way she'd looked at him under the nebula's light, it had cracked something open inside him, something he'd locked away since Proxima 9. He finished the piece, a simple necklace that felt heavier than its size suggested, and tucked it into his jacket pocket alongside the orange crystal. The station's artificial dawn was breaking, a dull shift in the overhead lights, and Jaxon knew it was time. He slung his blaster over his shoulder, its familiar way to comfort, and stepped back into the chaos of Vian 3's marketplace. The crowd was thinner this early, the air still thick with yesterday's smoke, and Jaxon found Sylra stall easily. She was there, her violet hair catching the nebula's glow through a nearby window, her orange skin shimmering as she polished a small trinket. She looked up as he approached, her black eyes brightening with a warmth that made his chest tighten. You're early, she said, setting the trinket down. Her tendrils swayed gently, a sign of quiet pleasure he was starting to read like a language. Couldn't sleep, Jaxon admitted, leaning against the counter. Kept thinking about yesterday, about you. Her tendrils stilled, and she tilted her head, a faint flush deepening the orange of her cheeks. Me too, she said softly, stepping closer. I didn't think you'd come back so soon. Got something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the necklace, holding it up so the etched eclipse caught the light. Made it last night. It's not much, but where I come from, we give things like this when we mean something. Sylra's eyes widened, her fingers brushing the metal as she took it from him. It's beautiful, she murmured, tracing the word with a reverence that made his throat tighten. What does it mean? It's my ship, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. My home, such as it is. And I want it to be yours too. He took a breath, stepping around the counter to stand before her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Sylra, I don't promise the whole galaxy, I can't. But I promise you a place, a life, with me. If you'll have it. She stared at him, her black eyes shimmering with something raw, shock, hope, fear, and her tendrils curled inward as if shielding her heart. Jaxon, she whispered, her voice trembling. No one's ever, why me? He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing the soft orange glow of her skin. Because I see you, he said, the words spilling out unfiltered. Not some outcast, not Crag's pawn. You're strong, you're real, and I've been running from everything until you. I want you with me, not because I have to, but because I choose to. Tears welled in her eyes, glistening like stars against the black, and she leaned into his touch, her breath hitching. I've never been chosen, she said, her voice breaking. Not once, not by anyone. You are now, he said, and she surged forward, wrapping her arms around his neck. Her lips pressed against his cheek, a Zynari gesture, he'd learned, of absolute trust, and the warmth of it sent a shiver down his spine. He pulled her closer, his arms encircling her waist, and felt her heartbeat racing against his chest, a rhythm that drowned out the station's noise. For a moment, they stood there, tangled in each other, the nebula's fiery light painting them in shades of orange and purple through the window. Jaxon's mind churned, a storm of doubt and longing clashing within him. He'd lost too much, friends, faith, pieces of himself, to believe in promises anymore. But Sylra's presence, her quiet strength, was a tether pulling him back from the edge. He wanted this, wanted her, more than he'd wanted anything in years. The peace shattered as a guttural roar erupted behind them. Crag lumbered into view, his many arms flailing, his bulbous eyes narrowing at the sight of them. What's this? He bellowed, his voice a grating rasp. Sylra, you lazy scrap, wasting time with this human. He's not worth your dust. Jaxon stepped in front of her, his hand resting on his blaster. Watch your mouth, Crag, he said, his tone low and dangerous. She's not your property. Crag laughed, a wet, gurgling sound, and waved a dismissive arm. She's mine, till her contract's up, another cycle, human. No one else wants her, and you're a fool to think otherwise. Zynari trash doesn't get picked up by your kind. Sylra flinched, her tendrils drooping, but Jaxon's anger flared hot and sharp. She's leaving with me, he said, his voice steel. Today. You touch her, you'll regret it. Crag's eyes glinted with malice, his arms twitching. You'll pay for that threat, he snarled, backing away. I've got buyers who take her off my hands for a price, better than you can offer, human. He retreated into the crowd, muttering curses, but Jaxon caught the flicker of intent in his gaze, a promise of trouble. He turned to Sylra, her face pale despite its glow, her hands clutching the necklace. He can't stop me, she said, though her voice wavered. But he'll try. He always does. Not this time, Jaxon said, taking her hand. We're gone in 2 days, I've got a job to wrap up, then we're out. Pack what you need, nothing more. We'll figure the rest later. She nodded, slipping the necklace over her head, the eclipse resting against her chest like a shield. There's not much, she said. Just, this crystal. She pulled a small orange orb from her cloak, its glow dim but steady. And a piece of fabric, purple, torn. It's all I have from, before. Bring them, he said, squeezing her hand. They're yours. We'll make new memories to go with them. Her smile returned, fragile but growing, and she rose on her toes, pressing her forehead to his in a quiet, intimate gesture. Thank you, she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. For seeing me. He tilted his head, his lips brushing hers, not a full kiss, but a promise, soft and fleeting, that sent a rush through him. Always, he said, and they stepped apart, the air between them charged with something new, something unbreakable. They spent the next hour planning in hushed tones behind her stall, Jaxon sketching out the Eclipse runner's layout on a scrap of metal while Sylra gathered her few belongings. He told her about his crew, Rhea, the sharp-tongued mechanic, Tor, the gruff pilot, people who'd become his makeshift family. She listened, her tendrils swaying with interest, and shared the faint memories tied to her keepsakes, a melody she couldn't place, a voice calling her name. As the market stirred to life around them, Jaxon felt a shift, a certainty settling into his bones. He'd spent years drifting, avoiding ties that could break him again, but Sylra was different. She wasn't just a passenger, she was a destination, a reason to stop running. Their quiet was interrupted by a shadow looming over the counter, Crag, back with a sly grin, his arms crossed. Enjoy your little moment, human, he sneered. Won't last. She's spoken for, big credits, big players. You'll see. Jaxon stood, his hand on his blaster, but Sylra gripped his arm, her voice steady. We're leaving, Crag. You're done with me. The creature laughed, retreating into the crowd, but his words hung heavy. Jaxon watched him go, a cold knot forming in his gut. He's not bluffing, he said, turning to Sylra. We need to move fast. She nodded, slipping the crystal into her pocket, her tendrils curling with resolve. 2 days, she said. I'll be ready. He pulled her close, their foreheads touching again under the nebula's watchful glow, and whispered, We'll make it. Whatever Crag had planned, whatever the galaxy threw at them, Jaxon knew one thing, he'd fight for her, for this fragile, fierce thing they'd started. And he wouldn't lose her. Chapter 4, Secrets from the Void. The marketplace of Vian, 3 buzzed with its usual clamor as Jaxon Varr stood at Sylra Keth's stall, watching her pack her meager belongings into a small satchel. 2 days had passed since his promise under the nebula's light, and the station's artificial dusk was settling in, casting long shadows across the grimy floor. The orange crystal and a tattered purple fabric scrap rested atop her cloak, the only pieces of her past she'd kept. Jaxon leaned against the counter, his leather jacket creaking, his green-gray eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of Crag. The slimy trader's threat lingered in his mind, big credits, big players, and he didn't like the taste of it. Sylra tied the satchel shut, her tendrils swaying with a quiet determination. The necklace he'd given her, etched with eclipse, hung against her chest, its faint shimmer matching the glow of her orange skin. That's everything, she said, her voice steady but soft, like a breeze cutting through the station's din. I'm ready. Jaxon nodded, his hand brushing hers as he took the satchel, slinging it over his shoulder. Good. The runners fueled up. We'll slip out quiet, Rhea's got the engines hot, Tor's on lookout. Crag won't know till we're gone. Her black eyes met his, a flicker of relief softening their depths. I still can't believe this is real, she said, her fingers tracing the necklace. Leaving with you, it's more than I ever thought I'd have. He smiled, a rare curve of his lips that reached his eyes this time. It's real, he said, stepping closer. And it's just the start. He wanted to say more, to tell her how she'd shifted something in him, how her presence filled a void he'd carried too long, but the words stuck, tangled in the scars of his past. Instead, he rested his hand on her shoulder, feeling her warmth through the threadbare cloak. Their quiet moment splintered as Crag's guttural voice cut through the crowd. Human. The bulbous creature lumbered toward them, his many arms waving, a sly grin splitting his glistening face. Thought you'd sneak off with my property, eh? Too late for that. Jaxon stepped in front of Sylra, his hand dropping to his blaster. She's not yours, he said, his tone cold and sharp. We're done here, Crag. Back off. Crag's laugh was wet and grating, his eyes glinting with malice. Not how it works, Varr. I've got a deal, credits you can't match. She's spoken for, and you're out of your depth. He gestured toward the shadows behind him, where a figure emerged, a tall Zynari in sleek silver robes, his skin shimmering like molten metal under the nebula's light. His eyes, black and piercing, fixed on Sylra with an intensity that made Jaxon's gut twist. Jaxon Varr, the Zynari said, his voice smooth as polished steel. I am Valorn, emissary of Zynar Prime. Step aside. The female is coming with me. Sylra stiffened, her tendrils curling inward, and Jaxon felt her hand grip his arm. Who the hell are you? He demanded, his blaster half-drawn. She's not going anywhere she doesn't want. Valorn's gaze shifted to Sylra, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Sylra Keth, he said, his tone softening with something like reverence. Last of the Keth dynasty, rightful heir to Zynar's throne. Your time in this filth is over. Your people need you. The words hit like a shockwave. Jaxon turned to Sylra, her face paling to a muted orange, her black eyes wide with disbelief. What? She whispered, her voice trembling. That's not possible. I'm no one. You're everything, Valorn said, stepping closer. Your parents, Lord and Lady Keth, were slain in a coup 20 years ago. You were smuggled away, hidden here. We've searched for you ever since the rebellion stabilized. You're the key to our future. Jaxon's mind raced, pieces snapping into place, the bounty message, Crag's deal, Sylra's fragments of memory. He tightened his grip on her arm, pulling her closer. She's not a key, he growled. She's a person. And she's with me. Sylra's hand tightened on his, her breath quickening. Jaxon, she said, her voice barely audible. I don't know what to believe. But I'm not leaving you. Not after everything. Valorn's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. A noble sentiment, but naive. Her destiny lies with Zynar, not some human drifter. Stand down, Varr, or this ends badly. Before Jaxon could respond, the station shook, a deep, rumbling blast that sent traitors scrambling and stalls toppling. Screams pierced the air as a squad of Skarvex mercenaries burst through the crowd, their biomechanical bodies gleaming red and black, weapons humming with lethal energy. Target acquired, one droned, its eyeless face swiveling toward Sylra. Move! Jaxon shouted, shoving Sylra behind the counter as he drew his blaster and fired. The first Skarvex staggered, sparks flying from its chest, but more poured in, their claws slashing through the air. Valorn ducked behind a crate, his silver robes flashing, while Crag squealed and fled, abandoning the stall. Jaxon grabbed Sylra's hand, pulling her toward a service hatch in the wall. Stay with me, he yelled over the chaos, kicking the hatch open. They tumbled into a narrow tunnel, the clang of metal echoing as he slammed it shut behind them. The air was stale, thick with dust, but it was a lifeline away from the gunfire above. They crouched in the dark, Jaxon's blaster trained on the hatch, his free arm around Sylra. Her breathing was ragged, her tendrils trembling against his shoulder. What's happening? She gasped, her voice shaking. Why are they after me? Because of what he said, Jaxon replied, his tone grim. You're not just Sylra anymore. You're someone they want, someone they'll kill for. She pressed closer, her hand clutching the necklace, its eclipse etching digging into her palm. I don't care who they think I am, she said, her voice rising with defiance. I'm not theirs. I'm yours, my home is with you, Jaxon, not some throne I don't even know. His heart thudded, a fierce warmth spreading through him despite the danger. He turned to her, his hand cupping her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. "And I'm not letting them take you," he said, his voice low and resolute. "I don't care if you're a princess or an outcast, you're mine, and I'll fight the damn galaxy to keep you safe." Her black eyes locked with his, tears glistening but unspoken, and she leaned into him, her forehead pressing against his in that quiet, intimate way they'd found. "I believe you," she whispered, her breath warm against his lips. "I trust you." The hatch rattled, a metallic screech signaling the Skarvex were close. Jaxon pulled her tighter, his mind racing for an exit. "We need to get to the runner," he said, helping her to her feet. "There's a junction up ahead, leads to the docking bays. We move fast, stay low." She nodded, slipping her hand into his, her grip firm despite the tremor in her fingers. They ran through the tunnel, the walls vibrating with distant explosions, the nebula's light filtering through cracks to guide their path. Jackson's shoulder ached where he'd slammed it against the hatch, but Sylra's presence beside him dulled the pain, a steady fire in the dark. They reached the junction, a rusted grate leading to the bays, and Jaxon pried it open, peering out at the chaos beyond. Skarvex swarmed the docks, their red lights flashing, but the Eclipse runner stood ready, Rhea's silhouette visible in the cockpit. "Almost there," he said, turning to Sylra. "You okay?" She squeezed his hand, her tendrils curling with resolve. "With you, I am," she said, and they slipped through the grate, darting toward the ship under a hail of plasma fire. Inside the runner, Jaxon sealed the hatch as Rhea powered up the engines, tore shouting coordinates from the NAV console. Sylra clung to him, her satchel clutched tight, and he pulled her into the co-pilot seat, his arm around her shoulders. "Hold on," he said, his voice a lifeline as the ship shuddered into motion. The station shrank in the viewport, Vion 3's chaos swallowed by the nebula's glow, but Jackson's mind churned. Sylra Keth, princess, heir, target. He glanced at her, her orange skin pale with exhaustion, her eyes fixed on him with a trust that pierced through his doubts. Whatever she was, whoever wanted her, he'd made his choice. And as the runner broke free into the void, he knew he'd burn every star in the galaxy to keep her by his side. Chapter 5, The Fight for Freedom. The Eclipse runner shuddered as it tore away from Vion 3, the Vortex Flame Nebula's fiery swirls filling the viewport with a chaotic dance of orange and purple. Jaxon Varr gripped the co-pilot's controls, his knuckles white, his green-gray eyes darting between the NAV screen and Sylra Keth beside him. She sat strapped into the seat, her orange skin pale under the ship's dim lights, her violet hair tangled from their frantic escape. Her tendrils trembled slightly, but her black eyes were fixed on him, steady with a trust that anchored him amidst the storm. "Rhea, status." Jaxon barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the engines. The mechanic's voice crackled over the comm, sharp and steady from the engine bay. "Shields at 60%, Captain. Took a hit dodging those bastards, but we're holding. Tor, get us a jump vector, anywhere but here," Jaxon added, glancing at the burly pilot hunched over the NAV console. Tor grunted, his fingers flying across the controls. "Working on it. Nebula's messing with the readings, give me a damn minute." Sylra's hand found Jackson's arm, her grip tight through his leather jacket. "They're still coming, aren't they?" she asked, her voice low but firm, no trace of panic despite the chaos they'd fled. He nodded, his jaw clenched as the rear sensors blipped red, 3 Skarvex pursuit drones, their biomechanical hulls glinting like bloodied steel against the nebula's glow. "Yeah," he said, meeting her gaze. "They don't give up easy. But neither do we." Her tendrils curled inward, a flicker of resolve crossing her face. "I'm not afraid," she said, though her breath hitched slightly. "Not with you." Jackson's chest tightened, a fierce warmth surging through him. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise, then turned back to the controls. "Hold tight," he said, his voice steady. "We're not done yet." The ship jolted as a plasma bolt grazed the hull, the shields flaring briefly before dimming. They're gaining. Tor shouted, slamming a fist on the console. Jump's not ready, we'll have to fight. Reroute power to the rear guns, Jaxon ordered, unstrapping himself and pulling Sylra with him. Sylra, stay behind me. We're taking the turret. She followed without hesitation, her satchel slung across her shoulder, the eclipse necklace bouncing against her chest. They raced through the runner's narrow corridors, the ship rocking beneath their feet as more blasts struck. Jaxon shoved open the turret hatch, a cramped pod with a single gunner's seat overlooking the void. He pushed Sylra into a corner, out of the line of fire, and slid into the chair, his hands gripping the controls. Through the viewport, the Skarvex drones loomed closer, sleek, insect-like machines with glowing red cores, their claws extended like talons. Jaxon fired, plasma rounds lighting up the dark, and one drone erupted in a burst of sparks, spiraling into the nebula's depths. One down, he muttered, but the other two swerved, their cannons charging with a menacing hum. Sylra pressed against the wall, her breath ragged, her black eyes wide as she watched him. Jaxon, she said, her voice cutting through the turret's whine. I can help, I know I can. You're not trained for this, he snapped, firing again, missing as a drone dodged. Stay back. A blast hit the runner hard, throwing Sylra forward. Jaxon lunged, catching her before she hit the console, his arms wrapping around her. The ship tilted, alarms blaring, and he pulled her close, his heart pounding against hers. You okay? He gasped, his hand cupping her face. She nodded, her tendrils trembling, but her eyes burned with something new, anger, defiance. I'm not helpless, she said, pulling free. I feel it, something inside me. Let me try. Before he could stop her, she stepped to the viewport, her orange skin pulsing with a faint, eerie light. Her tendrils stiffened, and she raised her hands, a low hum vibrating through the turret. Jaxon stared, frozen, as a wave of energy surged from her, a shimmering pulse that rippled outward, slamming into the drones. Their movement slowed, their red cores flickering, as if caught in a web of static. What the hell, Jaxon breathed, but he didn't hesitate. He fired again, the plasma tearing through the stalled drones, shredding them into fragments that scattered into the nebula. The turret fell silent, the only sound their heavy breathing and the runner's creaking hull. Sylra swayed, her knees buckling, and Jaxon caught her, pulling her against him. You did it, he said, his voice rough with awe. How? I don't know, she panted, her tendrils drooping as the glow faded from her skin. It just came out. Like it's been there all along. He held her tighter, his hand tangling in her violet hair, his lips brushing her forehead. You're incredible, he murmured, the words spilling out unbidden. I've got you, always. Her arms slid around his neck, her breath warm against his skin, and she pressed closer, her voice breaking. I couldn't let them take you, she said. Not you, Jaxon, not when you're all I have. The ship lurched again, a final shudder as Rhea's voice crackled through the calm, shield stabilizing. Jumps ready, Captain. Where to? Jaxon didn't answer right away, his gaze locked with Sylra's. Her black eyes shimmered with tears, but her jaw was set, her strength shining through the exhaustion. He pulled her into a fierce kiss, his lips crashing against hers, raw and desperate, a collision of fear and relief, of everything they'd fought to hold on to. She kissed him back, her tendrils curling around his shoulders, her taste sharp and sweet, a fire that burned away the cold he'd carried too long. When they broke apart, breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers, their breaths mingling in the tight space. We're not dying today, he said, his voice a vow. Not ever, if I can help it. She nodded, a faint smile breaking through her tears. Together, she whispered, and he felt it, a bond forged in that moment, unbreakable even by the galaxy's wrath. Rhea, punch it, he shouted, guiding Sylra back to the co-pilot seat as the runner's engines roared. The ship leapt into hyperspace, the nebula vanishing in a streak of light, leaving the Skarvex wreckage behind. The cockpit settled into a tense quiet, Tor muttering curses at the NAV console while Rhea's tools clanged faintly below. Jaxon strapped Sylra in, his hand lingering on hers, then took his own seat, his mind racing. That power, he said, glancing at her. You've never done that before. She shook her head, her tendrils still limp with fatigue. Never. It felt, old, like something buried waking up. Valorn called you an heir, he said, his voice low. Kethra dynasty, whatever that means, it's why they're after you. That energy, it's tied to it, isn't it? Maybe, she said, her fingers tightening around the eclipse necklace. But I don't care about dynasties. I just want us. He squeezed her hand, his throat tight. You've got me, he said. No matter what. The comm buzzed again, Rhea's voice sharp. Captain, we've got company, Zynari ship hailing us. They're demanding we dock or they'll open fire. Jaxon cursed, pulling up the sensor feed. A sleek silver vessel loomed in their wake, Valorn's ship, its weapons glowing ominously. Options? He asked Tor. Fight or run, Tor grunted. We're outgunned either way. Sylra sat up, her tendrils stiffening. Let me talk to them, she said, her voice steady despite her weariness. If I'm what they want, maybe I can stop this. Jaxon hesitated, every instinct screaming to keep her safe, but the fire in her eyes stopped him. All right, he said, tapping the comm, patch them through. Valorn's face appeared on the screen, his silver skin gleaming, his black eyes cold. Sylra Keth, he said. You've caused quite a stir. Surrender yourself to Zynar Prime, or your human and his crew die. Sylra leaned forward, her voice cutting like a blade. I'm not your prisoner, Valorn. I choose my fate, and it's with him. Back off, or I'll show you what I can really do. Valorn's expression faltered, and Jaxon grinned despite the odds. You heard her, he said. We're done running, but we're not surrendering. Your move. The screen went dark, the Zynari ship holding position, and Jaxon pulled Sylra close, his arm around her shoulders. You're a hell of a fighter, he said, his voice thick with pride. With you, I am, she replied, resting her head against him. Whatever came next, Zynar, Skarvex, or the galaxy itself, they'd face it together, their fire burning brighter than the nebula they'd left behind. Chapter 6, Eternal Flame. The Eclipse runner hung in the void, its engines thrumming softly as the Zynari ship loomed ahead, its silver hull glinting against the starfield. Jaxon Varr sat in the cockpit, his arm around Sylra Keth's shoulders, her orange skin still pale from the energy she'd unleashed against the Skarvex. The tension in the air was thick, the crew silent, Rhea at the engines, Tor at the NAV console, waiting for Valorn's next move. Sylra's black eyes burned with resolve, her tendrils stiff as she faced the screen, her hand clasped tightly in Jaxon's. Valorn's voice crackled through the comm again, smooth and unyielding. Sylra Keth, this is your final chance. Return to Zynar Prime, or we will take you by force. Your human cannot protect you from your destiny. Jaxon's jaw clenched, his free hand hovering over the weapon's controls, but Sylra squeezed his fingers, her voice steady as she replied. My destiny isn't yours to decide, Valorn. I'm not a tool for your counsel, I choose my life, and I choose him. Fire if you dare, but you'll regret it. The Zynari's expression flickered, a crack in his polished facade, and Jaxon leaned into the comm. She's not bluffing, he said, his tone hard. You saw what she did to those drones. Push us, and you'll lose more than a fight. A tense silence stretched across the void, the Zynari ship's weapons glowing faintly, then dimming. Valorn's voice returned, colder now. This is not over, Sylra. Zynar will claim its heir, one way or another. The screen went dark, and the silver vessel turned, its engines flaring as it retreated into hyperspace. Jaxon exhaled, his arm tightening around Sylra as the crew let out a collective breath. Nice play, he said, turning to her with a faint grin. You scared him off. For now, she murmured, leaning into him, her tendrils relaxing against his shoulder. But they'll come back. I can feel it. Then we'll be ready, he said, his voice a quiet vow. Together. Tor snorted from the NAV console. Where to, Captain? Can't exactly go back to Vian 3 after that mess. Jaxon glanced at Sylra, her black eyes meeting his with a question she didn't voice. Zynar Prime, he said finally. If they want a fight, we'll bring it to them. Sylra deserves answers, and I'm not letting her face it alone. She nodded, her hand resting on the Eclipse necklace, its metal warm against her chest. Let's end this, she said, and the runner's engines roared as Tor set the course, the stars streaking past in a blur of light. Zynar Prime emerged from hyperspace 3 days later, a planet of shimmering emerald seas and violet forests, its cities rising in spires of crystalline stone. The Eclipse runner descended under heavy scrutiny, Zynari patrols escorting them to a landing platform flanked by armed guards. Jaxon kept Sylra close as they disembarked, his blaster holstered but ready, Rhea and Tor trailing behind with wary eyes. Valorn awaited them, his silver robes billowing in the wind, flanked by a towering figure in black armor, Lord Zarek, his presence radiating menace. His skin was a darker orange than Sylra's, his tendrils thick and scarred, his black eyes cold as he regarded her. Sylra Keth, he said, his voice a deep rumble. The lost heir returns, at last. Sylra stepped forward, Jaxon at her side, her tendrils stiffening. I'm not here for you, she said, her tone sharp. I'm here for the truth, about my parents, about why you want me. Zarek's lips curled into a smirk. Your parents were fools, dreamers who thought their shield tech could save Zynar from its enemies. I ended them to secure our power, and I'll end you to keep it. Jaxon's hand dropped to his blaster, but Sylra raised a hand, her orange skin pulsing with that eerie light again. You don't scare me, she said, her voice rising. I've survived worse than you, alone, unwanted. But not anymore. The air crackled as she unleashed her energy, a wave surging toward Zarek. He staggered, his guards raising weapons, but Jaxon and the crew were faster, plasma fire lit up the platform, cutting down the guards as Sylra advanced. Zarek roared, drawing a blade, but she met him head-on, her power flaring brighter, slamming him to his knees. Jaxon reached her, his blaster trained on Zarek's chest. Finish it, he said, his voice steady. This is your fight. She nodded, her tendrils trembling with effort, and pressed her hand to Zarek's forehead. A final pulse erupted, and he collapsed, his black eyes dulling as the life left him. The platform fell silent, Valorn staring in shock as Zynari guards lowered their weapons, their loyalty wavering. Sylra turned to Jaxon, her breath ragged, and he pulled her into his arms, her warmth grounding him amidst the chaos. It's over, she whispered, her tendrils curling around his shoulders. Not quite, Valorn said, stepping forward, his tone cautious. You've proven your strength, Sylran. The council will hear you now, Zarek's reign is done. They faced the Zynari council in a grand chamber, its walls pulsing with violet light, the elders' faces a mix of awe and fear. Sylra stood tall, Jaxon beside her, as she spoke. My father built a shield to protect Zynar, not to conquer, she said, her voice clear. I'll honor that, with my chosen mate, not your chains. The council murmured, but an elder nodded, her tendrils swaying. The Kethra line endures. We accept your claim, and your union. 3 months later, Jaxon stood on a balcony overlooking Zynar Prime's capital, the twin suns casting golden light across the violet spires. Sylra joined him, her orange skin radiant in a flowing Zynari gown, her violet hair braided with crystalline threads. She'd taken her place as a leader, her father's shield tech restored to safeguard her people, but her eyes were on Jaxon, soft with a love that had grown through every trial. Thinking of running off again, she teased, her arms slipping around his waist, the eclipse necklace glinting at her throat. He turned, pulling her close, his hands resting on her hips. "Just admiring the view," he said, his voice warm. "Not bad for a guy who used to haggle for trinkets." She laughed, the sound bright and free, a melody he'd never tire of. "And not bad for an outcast no one wanted," she said, her tendrils curling playfully against his cheek. "Except you." "Lucky me," he murmured, leaning down to kiss her. Her lips met his, soft and fierce, a fire that burned away the shadows of their pasts. He deepened the kiss, tasting the sharp sweetness of her, the galaxy fading to just them, two souls who'd found each other in the void. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his, her breath mingling with his. "The councils approved our union," she said, her voice soft. "First human Zynari marriage in history. We're breaking every rule." "Good," he said, his arms tightening around her. "It's what we do best." They stood together, the sun sinking below the horizon, the Vortex Flame Nebula a distant memory replaced by Zynar's skies. Jaxon traced the scar on his chin, a mark of loss that no longer defined him, not with Sylra beside him, her strength a mirror to his own. She'd been shunned, cast aside, but he'd chosen her, and that choice had forged a destiny neither could have dreamed. "I found my star in you," he said, his voice low, a vow etched into the quiet. "And I found my universe in you," she replied, her black eyes shining. Under Zynar's twin suns, their love burned eternal, a flame no galaxy could extinguish. And there you have it, a journey from the grimy shadows of Vian 3 to the radiant spires of Zynar Prime, where Sylra Keth, an outcast alien girl shunned by all, found her true place in the heart of Jaxon Varr, a human who chose her against all odds. Together, they defied a galaxy, toppled tyrants, and forged a love that outshone the Vortex Flame itself. If this tale stirred your soul, don't hold back, drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and let us know your thoughts below. Tell us what cosmic stories you'd love to explore next, or simply leave a 1 if this adventure thrilled you, or a 0 if there's room to grow. Your voice keeps this nebula alive, and we're endlessly grateful for it. Thanks for flying with us. Until the next star ignites, stay curious, and we'll see you soon.